I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar on getting work done in virtual meetings, brought to you by the Wisconsin School of Business Office of Alumni Relations and the Wisconsin School of Business Center for Professional and Executive Development. Before we get started, I want to turn it over to the Director of Alumni Relations at the Wisconsin School of Business, Shannon Tim. Shannon?
Thanks, John. Hi, everyone. My name is Shannon Tim, and I'm the Director of Alumni Relations at the Wisconsin School of Business. Listen, I know that there's a lot going on right now, so I hope that wherever you're joining us from, that you are healthy and that you are safe. Obviously, things are changing rapidly with the coronavirus pandemic, but 2 weeks ago, we started to look at how we could provide relevant information to our alumni and just help in some small way. So we were really thrilled when our colleagues at CPED, thank you, John, and to everyone on your team, that they were game to create a webinar that would address what I think many of us are dealing with right now, and that's working remotely. Many of you, like many of us, have probably been doing that for a few weeks now, and it looks like we probably have a number of weeks still ahead of us. So if you're like me, you're trying to find ways to stay productive and stay connected to people. If you manage a team, you're trying to find ways to support your team members. You might have a family and you're trying to homeschool your kids. So we're grateful that we have Susan with us today to share some practical tips on these topics. If we go to our next slide, we've been getting a lot of questions from our alumni community about what's happening on campus. So I just wanted to spend a little time giving you a quick update. Across the top of your screen, you'll see a few websites. The first one is about UW's response and campus operations. The second is specifically for the Wisconsin School of Business and how operations are being handled at Granger Hall specifically. And then the third is a link to the university's experts database. As you know, the university is a wealth of knowledge, and we're really trying to leverage that expertise to help people get through this. So there's a lot of great information on that site, from how to talk to your kids about the pandemic to the economic impact that we can expect. In terms of what this looks like for students, all courses have been transitioned to alternate delivery for the rest of the semester and also summer term. Graduation, unfortunately, has been postponed, but the good news is that this is not going to affect or delay any student's ability to graduate. And we've also been fielding questions about how people can help. So there have been a couple emergency funds created. The first is a student emergency fund. This covers everything from unanticipated travel costs to get home for students who may have been studying abroad, food insecurity, housing and moving expenses. The second is a more local to the Madison community, but it's for UW Health and their COVID-19 response. So if you're interested in either of those, John is going to be posting those links in the chat box because I know that they're really long. So if you want more information, please feel free to navigate to those links. We also know that our alumni community is resilient, and we know that alumni want to share information and they want to help each other. It's so great. So we'd like to know how you're coping right now. Do you have advice, or has your workplace, your business pivoted in response? If you have something that you'd like to share, please email us at alumni@wsb.wisc.edu. We'd love to share what our alumni community is doing in response, and I'm sure that there are many of you out there who are doing great things. In terms of what else is coming up, we're assessing other ways that we can connect our community, but what we know for sure is that we'll continue to provide these webinars. So here's a list of upcoming dates and topics. I want to call out that June 10th is a new date for enhancing engagement and performance. So if you signed up for that one previously, just note that there's a new date. We'll also send out information for new things that might be added, and we're actively looking into those right now. So stay tuned to your email. I also want to call your attention to an event that's happening tonight. It's featuring 3 alumni from the School of Business, Phil Gross, Ricky Sandler, and Julie Van Cleve. They'll be speaking on a live stream tonight called the UW Now, and that's where UW experts, including alumni, are weighing in on a variety of topics related to the pandemic. So tonight at 7 p.m. Central Time, you can tune in and you can hear our alumni weigh in on the economic impact of the pandemic. This is hosted on YouTube, so there's no limit on the number of people who can join. And then John's also going to post this link in the questions box or the chat box as well. So one last thing I just want to say before I turn it back over to John is that I hope you're hanging in there with all of this. I know it's difficult, and I know everyone has their own unique situation and circumstances, but we're going to get through it. So with that, John, I'll turn it back over to you.
Great, thank you, Shannon. I'm going to introduce our presenter in just a moment, but first, just a quick word about the Wisconsin School of Business Center for Professional and Executive Development, or CPED for short. CPED partners with individuals and organizations to enhance performance and productivity through professional development programs, certificates, coaching, consulting, and assessments. More than 70 programs are delivered annually on site at the Fluno Center in beautiful and eerily quiet downtown Madison by instructors with practical real-world experience. We also partner with a variety of organizations to provide customized on-site training and have a number of virtual and online program options available as well. For more information about the offerings at the Center for Professional and Executive Development, please visit us online at uwcped.org. And again, I'm going to turn it over to Susan in just a moment here. First, I'd like to mention that we will be taking questions throughout today's session, and we'll be responding to those questions as time allows. You can submit a question using the questions box that you can find over in the sidebar, and you can expand or collapse the sidebar using the orange arrow near the top. I have some images on the screen there to guide you in that. You'll see that I did post the links down in the questions box to the events that and the web pages that Shannon had referenced earlier. Those are clickable, so if you wanted to pull those up so you can refer to them after the webinar, you should be able to do that now. And without further ado, I want to introduce today's presenter. Susan Vitterty is the author of 3 books: Master the Matrix, 7 Essentials for Getting Things Done in Complex Organizations, Cross-Functional Influence, Getting Things Done Across the Organization, and the Cross-Functional Influence Playbook. Since 2004, Susan has led a consulting practice focused on helping people work across and break down silos in complex organizations so that they can influence and get decisions made. Prior to founding her consultancy, she worked in organizational development positions at Baxter Healthcare and 2 small pharmaceutical companies. Susan and her team offer solutions for individuals, teams, and organizations in the form of coaching, consulting, workshops, keynotes, and e-learning. Susan has held adjunct faculty roles at Northwestern University and currently teaches influence and other topics at the Wisconsin School of Business Center for Professional and Executive Development. Susan has a BA from Central Michigan University and an MA from Indiana University. And with that, Susan, I will turn it over to you.
I'm delighted to be in front of you because I think right now, and anytime that we go through a lot of a big event, right? A traumatic event, a shift of any sort. So many things seem out of our control. One thing that remains in our control is our productivity and our skill building and our development. And so for me, this feels regulating. This feels like control. This feels like progress. And so I hope all of you feel that same way in terms of taking out this time. So let's go ahead and get started. Jen, you can forward it. So a few basics on this. First of all, I usually start this session and any session on meetings with convincing the audience that meetings are where things get done and convincing them that virtually you can make it happen. And the interesting thing is I don't have to do that anymore, right? So when I work with clients, I have a model of 7 different things that it takes to work across, and only one of them is meetings, and everybody wants to skip that one. And even if they do the meetings, they're like, oh yeah, the virtual thing, we got that, Susan. And so now what's happening is not only are the frequency of our virtual meetings have increased exponentially, what the content of those meetings are has shifted as well. We are truly getting work done and truly seeking to get decisions made. So no longer are these virtual meetings kind of our check-in points, or are we kind of using them to keep people updated. We're actually using them to get real work done. And so they've got to be really, really good. So if we take our same meeting practices that we had prior to COVID-19 and we apply them virtually, it's going to be disastrous, because quite frankly, this is a skill that everybody knows what it takes, but for some reason, very few people or companies take it seriously, and they kind of see it almost like a side job, right? So there is a shift going on right now that we realize that meetings, especially virtual meetings, are not a side job. They actually are where work gets done. And that's the mindset I always wanted to get people to adopt before I went into, and here's how you get it done. And it's the shift that we're going through, I think, helps us realize, boy, oh boy, work is getting done. And so we've got to take these things really seriously. So what I want to do to get this started is I'd like you to pick a meeting that you've got coming up in the next 2 weeks. Pull out your phone, pick a meeting. Don't pick don't pick a one-on-one. Either if someone's updating you or you're updating a boss, don't pick a one-on-one, but pick a broader meeting than that. And then we've got a poll that we're going to ask you what the objective of that meeting is. Is it to discuss, review, share, or understand? Is it to decide, determine, create, or establish, or around those, right? So you kind of get the gist. They don't have to be the exact words, but what's the nature of that meeting? Or is there not an objective set at all? Maybe you just have a title of the meeting. So you should see the poll now and go ahead and pick.
All right, Susan, so we're seeing about 59 or 60% in discuss, review, share, understand, about 37% under decide, determine, create, establish, and 5% for no objective set.
Okay, so give me those numbers one more time. I got the 30%, 37% in the middle. Oh, there we go, I've got it. 59% on the discuss, and then, 5% on no objective set. Okay, excellent, great. Thanks, John. Let's go back to the slides. So that's kind of lesson number one. We're gonna talk about the first rule. Go ahead and forward the slide, John. The first rule in terms of meetings is objective. So let's go further. So for those 37% of you, or excuse me, 59% of you that had discuss, review, share, and understand as an objective, which of these apply? And you're just going to pick one because that's the nature of the survey, but pick one. If you chose that meeting that was discuss, review, share, understand, if you were in that 59%, which of these apply? Just pick one. Okay, so we've got 6% it's urgent, 20% they've got to hear it from me, 51% it could be coordinated, which makes a ton of sense given where we are right now, 23% none of the above. Okay, let's go back to our slides. So 23% of you have a meeting that I believe you should talk yourself out of. So my first rule of meetings is talk yourself out of a lot of them. So the idea that I have and that I'm going into this webinar with is I'm going to give you the basics of good meetings first. So good virtual meetings require a good meeting in general, right? So it's got to be a good meeting in general. And then we're going to get to the virtual techniques at the end. But any of these meetings start with a really pause and ask yourself, do I really need to have this at all? So the rule number one is talk yourself out of it. So for those meetings that are discuss and understand and share in nature, and it's not urgent, they don't have to necessarily hear it from the leader. There's no coordinated effort or coordinated delivery that's required in terms of everybody has to hear it at the same time. And the information is totally self-explanatory. That's an email. So what I push people to really think about is to challenge any meeting that has understand, an understand type verb as the objective, right? So unless it meets one of these criteria, I really push people to think twice about it. So rule number one on good meetings is some of them just need to not occur. And in my reasoning behind this is I thoroughly believe, first of all, you've got to accept the premise that work gets done and meetings is where work gets done. Very rarely do we have a lot of tasks that are completely independent. We work in interdependent organizations, and if it's interdependent, very few things are totally independent, then meetings is where work gets done. But what we do is we have a bit of a knee-jerk reaction to scheduling meetings. And that's kind of like an automatic response. What I encourage people to do is press pause, right? And really think about should this take place? Because the more meetings we put into calendars, the more that system gets clogged, and the less time we have to really think about the critical meetings and do them justice, which is what we're going to talk about in terms of really thinking through the agenda, really truly prepping people. So we are kind of filling our system, so to speak, with meetings that are unnecessary, and that takes us away from things that are really critical, like really truly designing a meeting where a decision can get made, and really truly taking the time to make sure that people are completely prepared. So the first piece of it is we've got to do fewer of them. And I think by virtue of the fact when we do fewer of them, we do better meetings, and then we further decrease the number of meetings. And that decrease in meetings leads to all kinds of wonderful things like innovation and the ability to reach out and have time to build partnerships. And so that freeing up of information is really where I'm headed here. So I say that, and that's kind of my standard spiel on this in terms of that first rule on talk yourself out of it. Knowing that right now, we probably have more meetings than usual that are emotional, right? And so maybe understand is an okay thing. And it's our only means of connecting. We're not passing each other in the hall anymore. We're not grabbing lunch with each other. So I'm loosening up this rule a bit. But I still think that we've got to make sure that the meetings that we're scheduling are really, really important, and they're the right venue for disseminating and getting that work done. So that's rule number one. Consider pausing and talking yourself out of it to make room for the really important meetings and the really important work. Rule number two is get really clear on your outcomes, right? So I think of, when I think of a meeting, I think of what do I physically want on that, that virtual table at the end of that meeting. Is it a decision? Is it a timeline? Is it criteria? Is it different options? The more people think of their outcome physically, the better able you are to craft an agenda and invite the right people. So get really clear on your outcome and write it down. This is not a mental exercise. For you and for others, that objective has got to be written down. And bonus points if it starts with a verb like decide, determine, establish, outline. Those are all physical, right? So get very clear on your outcomes. Rule number three is craft your agenda. So the piece that I really push people on is this is not a list of topics. So oftentimes we think about agendas and we look at all the things that we need to talk about, and we're going to spend 15 minutes on this topic, on topic A, we're going to spend 25 minutes on topic B, and we're going to spend 10 minutes on topic C. I actually want you to flip how you think about agendas and think of it less as a list of topics and more as a thought process. You've got to get that meeting from point A to point B, those meeting participants from point A to point B, from a whole bunch of ideas to a decision, from a whole bunch of options to one final option. So you've got to think about it as the thought process you want to escort them through. And so the really high level template that I use on this is a 3-point agenda. So it's get grounded, time to get grounded, and that might be some discussion understanding. So that might be a sub-objective to your meeting, but you just kind of get grounded. And you kind of open it up in terms of here's the objective, etc. You've got some discussing as part of your agenda, and then you land on what your overall outcome is. You land on that decision, you land on that criteria, you land on establishing that timeline, whatever that happens to be. But the agendas that I work with people on have those three major pieces at their core. Most meetings today stop with 1 and 2, and we don't get to 3. And this is why we kind of continuously have another meeting. We get through 1 and 2 and we realize, oh shoot, we need another meeting. Everyone opens up their calendars and things are so busy that you can't get together for another 3 weeks. And by the time that you get together in those 3 weeks, we've forgotten what we got grounded on and what we discussed. So we kind of backtrack and then we start at it again. So for this piece, it's a very, pull it all the way through from get grounded to actually land. So craft your agenda, think of it as a thought pattern or a thought process you're going to take people through, not a list of topics with times assigned to it. Okay, rule number 4 is invite the right people and get them prepared. So note that this is rule number 4. You haven't even gotten to the point of figuring out who you need on that call. This is really, really critical. So my thought is, if you really do a good job of really honing in on only those times when you need an actual meeting, if you really get good and concrete and specific in your outcome, and then you look at that and go, okay, I'm going to take these people from point A to point B, then you've got your agenda, then you're going to be able to really, really pinpoint who you need on that call. So we kind of stop in the tracks this idea of just kind of inviting the world to these meetings. And when the more people you invite, the more possibilities you have for detractors and distractors, people that don't know why they're there in the first place, and they're kind of offering up input, but their input may or may not be pertinent. And so the more we can kind of get really, really specific on who you want in that room based on your outcome and based on your agenda, again, the fewer meetings we're going to have on people's calendars, which again frees them up for other things. So, okay, so who is the right people? I just did bunny ears and you didn't see me, but who is the right people? Do they have the D? So by that is, do they have decision rights? So what also happens is we invite people into calls who don't actually have decision rights. They're actually having to go back and forth to someone else who's the actual decision maker. As much as possible, populate your meetings with decision makers, not representatives. Ask yourself, do they really need to be there and why? And if you ask yourself that question and you get words like, well, they need to understand or they need to know, think of a different way to get that to them, right? So that if it's they need to understand or they need to know, there's other ways to get them the information without having them as a warm body on your call. So really, really pinpoint who needs to be there from a decision-making perspective, not from a they've got to hear this perspective. What do you need them to do with the information? What do you expect their role to be in that? And if you ask yourself in that meeting, if you ask yourself the why do they need to be there and what do you expect them to do, and the answer isn't clear, isn't obvious, or it's again something like understand or know, don't invite them. Figure out another way to get the information to them. They might be part of your overall strategy, but they don't need to be part of that specific call. And then the final piece of invite the right people is give them pre-work. I think about pre-work as always needing to have a purpose. So I never would recommend giving pre-work and saying, okay, we're going to talk on this on Friday's call. Here's the PowerPoint, review it before we get on the call. No. I recommend for people, when you give pre-work, make it something with a purpose and with a consequence. So the purpose sounds something like this. On our call on Friday, we're going to review these 4 options. See attached, and please let me know what your top 1 and 2 options are and why. In this meeting, we're going to review the contract. Please review this contract and come back to me with your top 3 concerns. On this, we're going to review these 5 candidates. Please come in with them ranked ordered 1 through 5. So you not only have them review something, you have them make a decision, come to a conclusion, so they truly come to that meeting prepared to discuss. And so this one is really key, because the other piece of this is to have consequences. So what you want to do is you want to be known as the person who runs an incredibly disciplined meeting, so that if you come unprepared, then there's a consequence to that. So does the meeting not take place? Are you, unable to kind of put your vote through because you weren't prepared? But whatever that consequence is that makes sense, you only have to do that once or twice, and people pick up on the fact that you are a very disciplined, high expectation meeting leader, and they're going to come prepared, and you're going to get much more done on your calls because of that, because they know they've got to be prepared. The reality of our meetings and calls is we're pretty loose with them. We have pretty low expectations. We kind of pat ourselves on the back if we send an agenda out 24 hours ahead, or maybe we do send out a deck of slides. I believe those expectations are too low. And one of the reasons I think we don't do meetings all that well is we don't have a lot of really good role models. And if I think about the role models I've had in this space, they are people who are incredibly disciplined. And I have a gentleman named Paul in my head who I worked with. There was no way in the world it would ever show up to one of Paul's meetings unprepared, because I knew there'd be a consequence, whether it's a conversational consequence or there is a consequence in terms of my degree to which I could influence within that meeting. So being known as that type of meeting leader makes your meetings much more, not only does it make your meetings much more productive, it actually makes it a meeting that people want to attend. So if I think about Paul, his meetings were so well structured, so well thought out, so disciplined in terms of how he ran them. I left every one of his meetings going, wow, we just really got some work done. You leave with a sense of progress. Right now, I feel like we leave our meetings and our calls with a sense of, what was that all about? Or, okay, that was a really long time. I'm not sure it was a good use of time. I'm not sure where we took this. But if you can create a culture of meetings for your team and for you as an individual of someone who really drives things and gets things done, you will never have a problem with people showing up to your meetings. They will want to be on your teams. They won't want to miss one of your meetings. If they have to choose between your meeting and somebody else's, they'll choose yours because you take what they're providing and you shape it into an outcome. And that feels really satisfying. And then the final note on pre-work is obviously give adequate notice. If you're going to expect them to do more than just review, you're going to have to give them more than just 24 hours. So rule number 4 is invite the right people and get them prepared. Rule number 5, facilitate the heck out of it. So here's where we get into some of the virtual pieces. So I've divided this up into a little bit of a breakfast club approach to what's it mean to facilitate a meeting. So the classic facilitator is the facilitator that keeps focus, right? So doesn't let people go down rabbit holes, uses parking lots, etc. Connects ideas. So if we're having a call and people are discussing, we're in that discussing mode, a really good classic facilitator connects ideas. So they say, okay, so John, what I hear you saying, is that similar to what Shannon brought up as well? And what are the connect between those two opinions, right? So John, if I hear you correctly, you're actually challenging what Betty brought up earlier. Is that correct? So you're constantly connecting ideas. When you don't connect ideas, your meetings tend to be, this is a very crude way to put it, a bunch of plops. So people voicing an opinion, plop, people coming up with an idea, plop, people, sharing, one experience, plop. If you do that, then you kind of just end up with all of these individual statements, and that doesn't really do us any good. The facilitator's job is to weave all that together, and in order to weave that, to move the group forward. So connect ideas is really, really key. Balanced participation. This is really challenging. We're going to talk about that when it's virtual, what that looks like. But you want to be able to make sure you're hearing from everyone. And we'll talk when we get to the virtual side of this in a moment in terms of how you really make sure that that happens on a virtual call, because it becomes even more important. Keeps things moving toward the desired outcome. And the technique I love on this is when you take a pause and say, okay, so far, guys, I think we've come up with these three things that we think are are reality. Whatever decision we land on, it's got to be this, it's got to be this, it's got to be this, right? So it's got to have A, B, and C. I also think that we've identified 4 basic possibilities. Is that where we are? Am I missing anything? So one of the great ways to keep it moving forward is to stop and pause and let them know where you stand, how much you've gotten so far, summarize the conversation so far, and then you build on that. It's also a great technique if things are getting a little lost, people are getting down in the weeds, or they're going off on a tangent, slow it down, come back together. Here's where we are. Here's our outcome. What's the next thing that we should do conversationally to get us to that outcome? But that's how you kind of keep things moving forward. And then obviously you manage time, right? So you're making sure that you're using time wisely. Just this classic facilitator is exhausting, right? So I often tell people that if you leave a meeting or a call and you're not thoroughly exhausted, you probably didn't facilitate. You probably just kept time, right? The opposite, like if we could move further to the left of the classic facilitator, it's like the most basic facilitator. They're under the underachieving facilitator, which is basically, okay, guys, we only have 5 more minutes to talk about this, and we move them from topic to topic based on time. So if you truly take the classic facilitator approach where you're really keeping people focused, you're synergizing, you are synthesizing ideas, you're connecting the dots, it's exhausting because you don't ever let your mind wander. So that's classic facilitator. Next one, the geek facilitator. Here is my technology. So now that we add technology onto that, right? So classic facilitator will get you through your in-person meetings, and it helps in virtual as well. Now we're expected to be a geek facilitator as well. Here are my recommendations for making technology work for you. Use video always, right? So this is ironic that we're not using video today. We've got a few too many people on the call and it slows down the bandwidth, but use video, especially. What's most important is using video for people that you want to connect with, for a team that right now needs to see each other. It doesn't matter anymore if you're in your PJs, right? I have, in the past 3 weeks, I have done video calls with my clients with no makeup on and the world's ugliest bun. I've seen them in their bathrobes. I've seen their unmade beds. I've met their dogs. It doesn't matter. I saw their face and they saw mine. And it's really, really critical right now. Always use video. It makes a huge difference in the degree to which you keep people engaged, people feel connected, and it makes a huge difference in the level of work that can be done. You got to have video, especially if you're doing more than updating. If you're deciding, if you're really cranking out work, get the video up there. Mute everybody upon entry, right? Just so it's just from a sound quality perspective, so that if people are wearing headphones, you're not hearing rustling, you're not hearing, again, dogs barking and people moving papers and setting things up. So mute everybody. You don't start out with people being annoyed from an auditory perspective. Use tools like polling and attendee annotation to keep people focused and engaged. We saw that, right? So we saw that earlier. I love the attendee annotation. Depending on the platform you're using, you can have them write text right there on the screen. It's really cool. So not even in the chat, because the chat sometimes can be hard to see, but if you can put it right there on the screen on the slide, it's awesome. So look for attendee annotation as an option in whatever platform you're using. Test your technology and make sure everybody else does too, for sure. That's key. And then start basic and then build with your bells and whistles. So what I would say is kind of think about it gradually. So for every call that you're on, maybe add something different. Don't try to do everything right out of the starting gates. So, and some of you may have already experienced this, like we kind of jumped fast into virtual meetings, and I want to do the polling, I want to do the annotation, and I want to do breakout rooms, and I want to do all these things. I would take it slow. Better to take it slow and simple and get your footing than try to do everything all at once. And then you have your homecoming court facilitator. So this is putting it all together. And this is a facilitator that combines the classic, combines the geek facilitator, also really keeps people engaged. They've mastered the technology. They've mastered the general art of facilitation. Now they're in the virtual space and they are able to really keep people engaged and focused and feeling like they're making progress, even though they're not all in the same room together. So my first recommendation is use slides to keep them visually focused. And so sometimes it feels like, well, I only have maybe 2 people on my team that are participating. The slides seem too formal. They're not too formal when you're working virtually, because that gives somebody something for everyone to visually focus on. That way you also have the auditory and you have the visual to reinforce your message. So don't drown them in slides, but I really, really recommend slides. Even if you wouldn't use them, Normally, if you were in person, consider using them when you're virtual. Pause and ask direct questions at least every 5 minutes. And in all honesty, this is really difficult because you'll get on a roll. You might want to put a Post-it note up. You might want to assign somebody else in your meeting to pause you and ask questions, and make sure that if you've got a small enough group that you go round robin. I was on a call today and I established within the first 5 minutes that I was going to ask a question and no one could sit. So the first question I posed, I got one person to respond and I said, okay, Vanessa, what did you think? Okay, Keith, what about you? All right, and Mercy, what about you? So I established early on that I was going, every time I posed a question, I was going round robin. So if you have a small enough setting, establish that so that everybody knows that they're going to be expected to kind of chime in. Keep it interesting, especially if it's a longer one. If it's more than 2 hours, consider changing speakers. Make sure you've got some thought-provoking questions, maybe move from slides to documents, but keep it interesting. Especially, I find the 2-hour mark is really, really critical. That's when people are really dragging. Give them a break, come back, have somebody else present. Not unlike what you would do when you were in person, but make sure it's there and you've got some variety in what you're providing. Use ground rules prior to the session. So things like commit to monotasking, the opposite of multitasking. People stay really engaged. Some platforms actually can tell you if they're typing. I think for sure, I think WebEx has that. So they may tell you if they're engaged or not. So there are some that can kind of gauge that for you. And so use that bell or whistle if you want to really track that and make sure that people are really engaged. Not necessarily to call them out, but to know, okay, maybe ask them a question at this point, or maybe I need to, spice things up, or maybe I need to take a break. But it's a good way to monitor engagement. Ask people to state their name before speaking, if that makes sense and if that's helpful. Have a mandatory personal intro at the start of each meeting. I've got one client of mine that's kind of trying to come up with something creative every day, where everybody says, okay, here's we're gonna connect. What's your dream vacation? What's the first vacation you're gonna take when we're done with quarantine? Give me, what are you fixing for dinner tonight? Whatever that is, but get people talking to replicate some of that, informal small talk that you usually have as people are entering a meeting. But it helps people get connected and helps people warm up. Whoops, can we go back? Thanks. Get really structured about your decision making. So as I mentioned in the beginning, we are, if all of our work is kind of transferring into this virtual world, that means decisions are getting made on these calls. It's not just a simple touch base. We are making decisions, and you're going to have to be even more structured virtually than you are in person. So my recommendations are call it out when a decision is on the table, on your virtual table. Okay, guys, I think we're entering in a decision to be made here. Let me just double check. This is the decision that we're making. So everybody's on board that, flashing red lights, we are in decision mode right now. We're not discussing, we're landing. Go round robin for input and for agreement on your decisions. Again, stop, pause, call people out by name, and then reiterate when you're landed. So, okay, guys, it sounds like we've made a decision, and the decision we've made is X. You have to be much more deliberate and call things out when you are making decisions virtually, so people know where you are in the decision-making process. Decisions can get really, really lost in virtual meetings, and then you kind of you're kind of in this circular motion of continuing to meet, and some people think you landed that plane and you made that decision, and oh, lo and behold, you did not, and you keep circling. Rotate roles. Have somebody be your timekeeper. Have somebody be your participation guard. So one that makes sure that everybody's heard, one that pauses you to ask for questions, one that calls out people's name on the round robins. It helps to pull in a few people, and by having roles assigned, people are much more engaged. If you're doing all of this yourself, then it's easier for them to disengage. So spread love, spread the roles, and get people engaged in terms of making that meeting work. And then finally, integrate water cooler time. So take the last 5 minutes and talk about your meeting process. What went well? What do you wish we had done differently? What different ground rules might we apply next time we're together? So usually that takes place in the hall, where people go, that was a great meeting, or oh my gosh, we didn't get anything accomplished. I wish we would have done X, Y, or Z. Integrate that into the actual structure of your call. So there's your classic, your geek, and your homecoming court facilitator roles on these virtual meetings. Okay, so in summary, productive virtual meetings start with great meeting practices. Talk yourself out of it, really question. When the less meetings you do, the better meetings you're going to have, because you'll be able to put forth time in really planning and structuring them. Number 2, get clear on your outcome. Think of it concretely. Think of it as a work product. Number 3, craft your agenda. Remember, it's not a list of topics with times. It truly is a thought process you're going to take people through. Number 4, invite the right people and get them prepared. Remember, that comes at step number 4. Don't invite a whole bunch of people, then figure out what you're going to do. That's kind of the typical pattern. And then we have the wrong people in the room. This ensures you've got the right people and only those people on that call. And get them prepared with pre-work with a purpose. Number 5, facilitate the heck out of it. And then I've got one more bonus one. Don't let your meetings be islands. Manage the white space. So our white space got whiter, right, now that we're all virtual. I always make a joke that the white space before meeting or between meetings is where work goes to die. Right, so you're in a meeting and then everybody disperses, and then they, if you've got like 3 weeks between that meeting, some people are going to be talked out of what you just decided. Some people are going to forget you decided. Some people are going to forget what you even talked about. Some people are going to get distracted and not do their follow-ups. So in that space between is where decisions and work go to die. When we're talking virtual, that's even more at risk, right? So I think of the meeting facilitator role as not just within the confines of that call, it's afterwards as well. So it starts with having great meeting notes and great follow-up skills, right? Holding people accountable, making sure that you outline, here are our next steps, and hold people accountable through email. Touch base. If you think somebody's at risk, if you've made a decision or you're narrowing a decision, you're afraid that maybe their boss is going to, talk them out of it, follow up with them. Think about it as almost like micro meetings and touch bases in between those, so that all your work doesn't die in between your meetings. So don't let them be islands, kind of manage that white space. And like I said, the white space just got whiter because we're all virtual. And questions. So John's going to take a look at the questions you've submitted. Continue to submit those now. And we've got not quite 15 minutes to answer some of those. So John, what are you seeing so far?
All right, we haven't had any questions come through yet, but I'm going to give everybody just a moment or two to get those submitted. And again, you can use that questions box in your GoToWebinar control panel to send questions over, and then I will read them aloud for Susan. Susan, one of the questions that came through is, what is your point of view, or do you have a point of view on Amazon's 6-page narrative versus PowerPoints, or spending the first 10 to 15 minutes of a meeting together reading and then discussing next steps and actions?
Yeah, it's I'm familiar with their narrative. I actually did some work with them this summer on influence, and their narratives play a huge role in how they influence. It is one of their influence tools that other organizations would never think of. I love it, and here's why. It forces the owner of that to truly think things through. And those narratives are pretty structured, they're pretty specific, they're pretty prescriptive. So it forces you to thoroughly think it out and get it down on a piece of paper that everybody can step into your context and into your idea kind of at the same spot. I think it's brilliant. And at least the folks that I worked with at Amazon love it. Like when we talked about it from an influence perspective, they said they can't imagine influencing anything without that now. So no, I'm a big proponent because it forces you to be diligent, and anything that provides some diligence, I'm all for.
All right, thank
Great
you, Susan.
question.
As I'm reading the next questions, I'm going to jump back just 2 slides. I had a request for someone to review
Sure.
those the 5 practices here. So I'll leave this up as we move forward with the next questions. So how do you get people to take turns in roles?
Mm-hmm. I just set that up, right from the very beginning. That and this is, you kind of have a window of opportunity if you've got, especially an ongoing meeting. Say, guys, one of the ground rules we're going to have going forward is we're going to kind of share the wealth here, and each take a different role, and kind of rotate through those. So because this is kind of all new, I would set up the practice right now and the expectation right now. And it's kind of, once it's a ground rule, it becomes less about you enforcing it, and the ground rule is out there, and to call people on it if they don't serve that role, and then just make sure that you're rotating them all the way through. Sometimes I have people that go, oh, I'll be all-time note taker. I'm not a proponent of that. I think that those roles should absolutely should not only be assigned, they should be rotated. So make it a ground rule, reinforce it, and rely on, peer pressure. They're going to see everybody else is participating in that way, and they should jump into the rotation. Another great question.
Thank you, Susan. I've had a couple questions come in about the recording of the session being available. You will receive a link to a recording of the session within the next few days, so please keep an eye out for that. Another question we had here, Susan, was from an individual who is going to be starting a new job where they will be managing a team globally. And the onboarding in the first few months will all be virtual. And wondering if you had any advice for starting a new job in a virtual environment and managing and learning with a team in a virtual environment.
Wow, that is that's a challenge, right? For a lot of us, we are shifting existing relationships to virtual, right? If you're starting a new job, then you don't have those existing relationships, and it's all brand new, and you're doing that virtually. I think my first piece of advice would be to make sure that you work with your manager to figure out who your really critical partners are, and think about it from this perspective. So, who might you hand work off to, right? So maybe you hand off something to them, or they hand something off to you. Whose input are you going to need as you make decisions? Who's going to need to buy in to the things that you produce or the decisions that you make? But work with your manager to figure out who your critical partners are, and then make sure that you've got time with that person individually on video to get to know them. Get to know them personally. Start with, so tell me about yourself, right? And share things with yourself. Get to know them personally, and then set up kind of communication understandings with them. So what kind of information will you need from me? What's the best way to provide that information to you? And what information do you think I need from you? So set up some parameters in terms of what you guys share, what information you share, and how you share it. But go to those critical partners. Do some good one-on-one, not group, one-on-one with video. Set some parameters in terms of how you're going to stay connected, especially now that it's virtual. It'll be even bigger challenge. I find that almost all my clients are global, right? So I find that those approaches, and the sharing of personal information tends to be culturally different, so you might want to ease your way into that. But the basics of reaching out via video individually and having conversations about how we're going to communicate and keep each other posted are global, right? They're globally recognized as good practices. Like I said, the one that you might want to get some advice on is the degree to which you kind of, how quickly you share more personal information and connect with them personally. But it will take extra effort, no doubt about it. But get it down to those critical partners and get traction with them. And I think you're going to be off on the right foot. That's a challenge. Great question.
Thank you, Susan. So a lot of changes have occurred lately with how we're running internal meetings. Is there any guidance or advice you could offer on running external meetings, and specifically with sales teams who might be more used to meeting with prospective clients in person?
Right. Yeah. You know, the external meetings, I think the same rules apply. The thing that gets tricky is that you probably need to, when you're working externally, it's a little bit of a different dynamic in terms of being prescriptive with your ground rules. So I would probably be a little bit more inclusive with that. Like start every call with, okay, we're all new to this virtual thing. Here's how we usually approach our virtual meetings. Here's our 3 key ground rules. Do you guys have ground rules that you follow? So that you're both kind of on the same page of, trying to make that work and utilizing the ground rules of both teams. I think it's a great way. Don't assume that the way you run virtual meetings is the way that client runs a virtual meeting. And I think they'll appreciate you taking time out to make sure that it's a great session. And again, I think it's probably going to take even more follow-up, right? So as we work with people externally, I can see that there's going to be more micro meetings that take place or emails to follow up just to make sure that you're checking understanding, make sure everybody's still on the same page. So I see almost the pre-work and the post-work on this becoming increasingly important, especially when you're dealing with externals, which are almost, kind of like one step removed. They're not, they're not within your internal, they're one step removed. And I think those micro meetings are going to become even more important to stay connected and stay in touch.
All right, thank you, Susan. And finally, can you talk a little bit more about the difference between topics and agenda items?
Yep. So if you want, it'd probably take too long to flip back and forth. So the traditional view of an agenda is I have topics, right? So I want to talk about A, B, and C. And so I look at that and I go, oh, A is not really big. I'll give it 15 minutes. B is kind of big. I'm going to give it 30. And C is kind of medium. I'm going to give it 10. That's kind of your traditional way of looking at an agenda. What I'm saying is it's not a list of topics. It's a thought process. So I'm starting that meeting with a group of 6 people that, I'll make it really simple, that don't know what color their conference room chairs should be, right? And so we're here without a decision, and I need to get them to land here on a decision. What are the steps I need to do to get them there? And that's the difference between an agenda that's a list of topics and an agenda that actually drives to an outcome. So if you think about those 3 major pieces, so it's get grounded. So we're all here together to do this today. Discuss what are our options, and then you begin to narrow those options. If you think like that, it's a completely different way to think through your agenda. It's not just topics that are assigned times. It's how do I help them think this through to get to that outcome? And if that helps.
Great, thank you. And that concludes the questions that we had. Are there anything else you wanted to share, Susan?
I don't think so. Did I have one final slide? I don't remember if I had another final. Yeah, slides, questions.
Oh,
Yep,
that
that's
was
it.
the end.
Yeah,
All right,
that's it.
wonderful. Okay, great. Well, Susan, I want to thank you for taking the time today to share your experience and your expertise and your knowledge. And thank you everyone who joined us on the line for today's webinar. This has been recorded, as I mentioned, and we will be sending out a link to the recording in the coming days. And details about how you can access that recording will be in that email that you receive. You'll also be receiving a survey about your experience today, and we ask that you do take a few minutes to complete the survey. We really do look at all the responses, and we use the responses on that survey to make sure that we're bringing you the most relevant, timely, and useful interaction and content during these webinars. So ask of you again, please take a few minutes to complete that survey once you receive the link. With that being said, on behalf of the Wisconsin School of Business and the whole UW community here, we hope you stay healthy and safe during these trying times. And thank you again for joining us, and hope you have a wonderful week. Thank you.